Well, let's see. I met John 1974 when I first came to interview at IBM. It was pretty interesting. Joel Birnbaum was my host. He was at the time a senior manager in the department, and he was explaining to me the people on the agenda. And he said, "Oh, John Cocke, this is the smartest man in the United States." So I thought to myself, well, this is a good start for an interview. And then John, actually, it was hard to find him because, as you know, he always wanders around. When the time came, Joel had his secretary look for him. We finally tracked him down, and John came into his office, and I introduced myself. He didn't look like the smartest man in the United States, but he said, "Well, what are you working on?" I thought, well, since he's well known for computer architecture, I'm on relatively safe ground. I will tell him about digital signal processing. And I started describing my thesis. And about 5 minutes into my description, he went to the board and wrote more or less the essence of the rest of my thesis. So that was a pretty rude awakening. But then we had a very interesting discussion about my work in the Army and in communications and so on. And finally, somebody had to come and pull me out to take me to the next guy on the list. John walked with me and joined the other interview. So it was quite a meeting. I think he actually was one of the reasons why I came to work for IBM, even though IBM was not particularly known in digital signal processing in my area. But he and some of the other people that I met on this interview, I thought, well, there's something to learn from these people.
Okay, very good. Tape is rolling.
When you hired in, did you actually work with John?
Yes, I hired to work into a project which was to do a central exchange. And John was in all areas of this project. As a matter of fact, he came up with the subject on which I subsequently ended up working with him and Sam Vinograd. And that was, this was going to be an all digital exchange in which we were going to do everything that used to be done analog digitally, which is what I was interested in. And John said, why don't we do time division multiplexing to frequency division multiplexing digitally instead of having these big racks with banks of filters that, you know, get all out of tune, etc., etc. So it took me a few days to understand what he was talking about. But that's usual with John. He comes into your office, starts writing on your blackboard, and then it takes you a little bit to figure it out, and then you only realize that he had a tremendously good idea. So we thought a little bit about it, and it ended up being actually a very interesting piece of work. It led to, first of all, a novel approach to do this particular thing. It led to Sam Vinograd, out of this work, subsequently discovered what is known as the Vinograd Fourier transform, because partly we were doing the requarter Fourier transform in doing this transformation. And it ended up with a joint paper that we co-authored. IBM never really got into the central exchange business, and we really didn't follow up on this work. But I remember distinctly when I was at a conference, a fellow from NEC walked up to me and said, "Oh, Dr. Peled, I'm very pleased to meet you. You co-author of this paper, which we implemented, and it really works very well." So we know that it wasn't only theoretically good, it also works.
When you started working with John, were you fairly young in the field, and was this a period where you were developing a lot yourself?
Well, you could say that I was right after my PhD, so I was young in the field. I'm still young, but at that time you could say I was pretty novice. And I actually moved from more the algorithmic side of digital signal processing into the hardware architecture of digital signal processors to a great extent due to John's influence. And as a matter of fact, my next project was the RSP, which was known as the Research Signal Processor, subsequently the Real-Time Signal Processor. And it was greatly influenced, its architecture was greatly influenced by the ideas that John was fermenting at the time of RISC. This was 1975 or so. And the RSP had many of the characteristics which were inspired by my discussions with John. Things like a separate instruction store and data store, things like non-hardware interlocking pipeline. And one of the things that it had, which was a way to do multiplication by using only additions and subtractions, was one that he specifically pointed out to me.
What did you find exciting about working with John?
Well, the variety. He knew a lot about every area you could think of. And, well, working with John was always exciting because it was the most unexpected things would happen. I remember one trip when we went down to Tucson because John had this idea that we could use the spectrum on magnetic tape in a much better way through digital signal processing. So we went down to Tucson to talk to the people about this new technique. And, you know, Tucson, it's a long flight. We get there. I was dead tired. John says, why don't we go and have a drink and discuss it a little bit? And here we're sitting, it's 12 o'clock in California, well, not California, Arizona. So it's only 2 hours away, 2 o'clock my time, 2 o'clock his time, I might add. And he's was a few years my elder at the time. And he's writing equations. And he also, at that time, had a few beers. And I only had one. I couldn't figure out what he was writing. He filled 3 napkins with all the equations for our meeting tomorrow. And I kept nodding and nodding. Then I grabbed the napkins and I took them with me so that at least I have a historical record of this for my next morning's meeting. But it was typical. He would constantly flow with ideas and notions, and you know, he was indefatigable, so to speak.
We're tricking you.
I see.
When you think of John's work, what's the first thing you think of?
Well, I think of variety. He really is interested intellectually and has unique ideas in a number of areas. And they're diverse. They are in computer architecture, compilation, which is his main field, but in magnetic recording, in new schemes to do echo cancellation, which is really digital signal processing. I know he was working on a novel flying head for magnetic recording. And I also, while not firsthand witnessed it, I know that he has lots of ideas there of silicon, semiconductors, and so on. So it's really the very broad range. And in every topic, he's quite knowledgeable. And people that talk to him think that that's his area of expertise, which is quite amazing.
What's John's greatest strength?
I think John is very effective in getting people excited about his ideas and follow up on them. Because clearly to accomplish what he has accomplished in a number of areas, it requires other people to pick up on these ideas and elaborate them and implement them and so on. And John has a very unique personality. First of all, his leadership and really his intellect are leadership qualities, so people kind of respond to that. But in addition, you know, he follows up, he comes, he encourages during the work, and does it in a rather low-key and gentlemanly fashion so that people feel good working on this. And we have a department in the Thomas J. Watson Research Center, the Advanced Mini-Computer Systems, or Advanced Workstation Systems as we now call it, or better known as the 801 group, which is approximately 40 people that have been working for the last, I would say, close to 12 years, essentially on John's ideas, elaborating them. adding to them, and in constant mutual reinforcement.
Actually, I had no period of time excited.
Well, I think one of the more exciting projects that had John in it that I'm familiar with is the America project. In approximately 1984, John came up with what is currently the architecture of the RS-6000. At that time, it was known as the America project. And John would camp in my office and really say, Abe, we have to do this, and so on. And it was. I mean, it was the right time and the right set of ideas. One day I asked John, why did you call it America? And he said, well, Abe, this is a well-known story from sailing, which is the first America's Cup was run, and the Queen was there watching for the sailing ships to come around the bend. And the first ship appears, and she turns to the admiral and says, which ship is that? He looks through his binocular and says, it's the America, Your Highness. And she says, who's second? He looks again through his binocular and says, there is no second. And that's why he called it the America. And I think that now that we have the product out, it's quite clear that it's quite far out in front in performance. And so 5 years ago, that's what started. And I think it was a very exciting period, in particular when the IBM company really decided to do it. There was a task force run by the late Jack Bertram, and he recommended, let's do it. And John and a number of his colleagues decided to move to Austin to join that team and make it happen. And I think that January of 1986, when everybody was getting ready to move, and there was a lot of excitement. I think it was a particularly, a project that kind of got going, and now that we have the happy ending, makes it a really great story.
Did you do any?
Well, I don't know. I would call him a scientist and a gentleman. John, those that know him, know that he's a real gentleman. And he's a great scientist. And I think that combination is what makes it work.
When you say gentleman, what is the aspect that you're drawing out?
Well, gentle, of course, highly civilized, knowledgeable about things, considerate.
Put you somewhere in the middle, don't worry.
Okay, the way people work together in the 801 building, the famous Saarinen building. My recollection, and I think the experience today, is that it's not exactly, at least in our area, which is computer science, the way it was planned. The reason actually John is very effective is not because he walks the hallways where you can see outside and all that, but rather he walks the hallways and goes into people's offices and talks to them. Not many people meet in the hallways and have real discussions. They have now the alcoves, which I think help a little bit. At that time, there were no alcoves. And most of the discussions really have to be forced by people going to other people's offices. I was a postdoc when I first started, and I had what was known as a two-thirds office. A two-thirds office means like it sounds. It means an office that's smaller, and so it has a desk and a blackboard, which John always would walk in and write on and so on. And I remember my neighbor saying, well, how can you do any work? Because, you always have John, and they're writing on your blackboard, and I cannot concentrate. So I said, well, you should start listening. Maybe you'll get some good ideas.
That's wonderful. Significance of John.
Well, I think John's probably single most important contribution to computer science is the one that has been recognized by the Turing Award, and that's for computer architecture of very high performance machines, and really the unique combination of machine architecture and compiler technology, the marriage of which makes for a very effective computer.
We've been hearing rumors and the other stories that people are telling us that they're going to tell, and all of them come back to the fact that someone wrote his Turing Award lecture.
Well, I had the actual honor to be John's manager at the time when he received the Turing Award. And John is not what you would call a person that sits down at a desk for any length of time. On the other hand, the Turing Award has a great tradition of you have to submit a paper which is subsequently published and with an interview and so on. And we all felt that this would be an important thing for John to have such a paper. So John and I sat down, and I would walk with him and solicit what he really would like to say. And eventually, and as a matter of fact, Al Chang would join us, and Fran Allen, and we reconstructed something that was really fascinating to me, because I didn't know many of the things, how chronologically John's ideas developed over the years. And I think his Turing Award paper, which is really the essence of his quest for high performance, in which it's quite clear that as early as the 1960 plus, he had the very clear idea in his head of what is a very high performance computer. All he had to wait for is the technology to make it really possible, so that it's not a big building full of vacuum tubes. But all his ideas were in his head. As a matter of fact, the ideas that he already had will be pursued for many more years until they can be implemented in a effective manner. So it was an interesting experience, and I learned a lot from it.
So you tell the story. It was wonderful.
Well, when did I first meet John Cocke? It was on my interview at IBM. Joel Birnbaum was my host, and he was going through the schedule with me, and John Cocke, I think, was the third or fourth person I was going to see before lunch. And they didn't say anything about his area of interest or anything like that, so I asked Joel, who's John Cocke? He said, well, John Cocke is only the smartest man in the United States. And I thought to myself, that's a good one to interview. And I said, what's his area? And he said, well, it's computer architecture and everything else. And when the time came, we were looking for John, since he's never in his office. Eventually, he was tracked down. He came to his office, and we started. He asked me, what are you interested in? What did you work on? And because he obviously didn't attend my lecture. And I started explaining to him, the essence of part of my thesis. And after 5 minutes, John walks to the board and continues the equations and says, that's probably what you came up with. And it was the rest of my invention. So I thought, well, that's okay. He already has a PhD, so he should be able to do this. But then we proceeded to discuss many other things. We talked about telecommunications in the Army, and about the project, which was to build a telephone exchange, all digital and so on. And they came to pick me up for my next interview. Then at lunch, we had further discussion and so on. So he was probably one of the reasons why I chose to come to IBM, even though IBM was not particularly known in digital signal processing. But after I met him and a few of the other people in the interview, which were really people you could learn from. And that's what I was interested in the beginning of my career. So